Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. My guests today are two really interesting people, Nets Daniel and Jim Thomas, who are currently the co-executive directors of the ETC Group, which is a small independent international research and advocacy collective that tracks the impacts of emerging technologies and corporate concentration on the rights of marginalized people, on food systems, biodiversity, and traditional communities. At least that's how they've asked me to describe them. But the ETC group generates the most interesting and detailed reports on all of these topics. That it is quite an extraordinary, small but immensely productive group, but too little known. And I think it's really important to draw attention to their work. And in the context of the COVID 19 crisis, the ETC group is working to spotlight how agribusiness and big data giants are seizing this moment to accelerate inequitable technologies and policies, and to show and highlight the crucial role that the peasant food and food workers, the present food web and the food workers were really the ones helping communities through these interlocking crises. So I'm really pleased to welcome our guests for today's meeting. Welcome, Jim. Welcome, Neth. Neth, I
Lovely.
think you're there we go. Great. Uh, for Jim, you're in Quebec somewhere, are you?
Up in the
Uh,
mountains, yeah, just north of Montreal.
okay. And Neth, where are you?
I am in southern Philippines, in Davao City, in the island of Mindanao. The
Oh,
most
right.
exciting part of the Philippines, as I always say.
Okay, so it's late night for you, for which I apologize.
It's night,
Um,
but not very late.
okay, good. Well, it's really nice to see you both again. Um, I really wanted to follow up on a really interesting interview that you have on your website, which was done by Zara Malou and interviewed the team on this whole issue of big data, big surveillance, and in the industrial food system. Um, and the question that's immediately posed is, how are these data giants and agribusiness seizing this particular pandemic moment? Because I think there's a crucial starting point on this. Neth, might you start on responding to that, and then Jim, perhaps we can bring you in on after that.
Well, there are different ways on how the big tech, in particular, and agribusiness are cashing in on the pandemic. Of course, like the most obvious for us, whether you are a producer or a consumer at this time, of course, is how social media have really boomed during this time. Of course, that's all using digital platforms that we know. And also, there's so much reliance now on digital communications, not just among NGOs who have been cut off from each other by the lockdowns, but also even government, and also even among social movements. So we actually rely more and more on the digital communications because of the isolation and the distancing that the lockdown has put us into. And that's the more obvious ones that are not too hard to explain. But the ones that don't really go into the radar, especially those who are not following tech, is how all these companies are actually being relied on more and more in the field of food and agriculture at this time of social distancing and lockdowns. Like we have seen how governments, like even in this part of the world, in the Philippines, for example, that have been really promoting digital platform for big companies. Like we have this company called San Miguel Corporation that have actually aggressively promoted itself to provide food deliveries and also supplies, both for retail and consumer line in terms of providing food supplies at this point and delivering and all that. So also the big supermarket chains have also relied more and more on digital platforms in reaching out to their consumers and also their clientele at this time. And all of this are actually happening, and this is the kind of the big normal, that is new normal, that is being promoted even by government. Like I was in a discussion recently where the Minister of Agriculture was in, and we were quite, of course, well, we hear a lot of the political things that they want to mouth, but then the big message is that we have to more and more rely on digital platforms to sell, to bridge consumers with producers, and also to allow the middlemen, no, to be able to sell and reach out to consumers. And all of this are actually being promoted, despite the fact that during the lockdown, that it's not actually this big, food sellers or even these chains that have actually provided food for most of the consumers who are outside of the cities, or even in the hubs, in the edges of the margins of the city, like where I live, for example. Like we have actually more relied on direct links with producers, with small farms who have actually reached out to consumers directly, and there are even actually NGOs that actually branch into business that allows them to provide the link, the bridge between producers and consumers. So there are practically two realities that are happening, but then the reality that's being sold to us as the part of the new normal is one that is really anchored to digital technologies and digital platforms. So that's my initial take on this.
So I mean, why are they collecting this data? Why, what use is it to them? I mean, how is it being used? Why is it a problem, or is it a problem? Jim, maybe you could.
Yeah, it is a problem, first of all, and I think I just want to put some figures on the shift that's going on at the moment in our global economy towards this massive collection of data, and I think what's, in the context of COVID, what's important to bear in mind is that we were already entering a massive restructuring of the economy around, what some are calling surveillance capitalism or data colonialism. That we were already seeing the rise of these massive digital platforms like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and also the Chinese, Alibaba, Tencent, and so forth. What the pandemic has allowed is an acceleration. It's a massive acceleration of plans that were already underway. I think I just wanted to give some statistics. At the moment, those 5 digital companies in the US, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, they're often called the GAFAM, now account for 20% of the value of all the stocks in the Standard & Poor. There's something like 40% of the value of all the NASDAQ. They are outrageously heavy in power and money. 4 of those companies, Google, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, are each trillion-dollar companies. This didn't exist a few years ago, trillion-dollar companies, but they now are. Just for context, the entire cost of COVID is thought to be around 4 trillion. So there's about an inequality there. And over the time of the pandemic, those tech billionaires have added hundreds of billions, in fact, something like about $500 billion to their personal wealth, particularly Amazon and others. So, we're seeing a massive increase in the power of these companies at this moment. And the things that they've wanted to do for a while, where they already play large in how people consume entertainment, how people connect and communicate, but now they really want to play in areas that have real money behind them, like the food market. Suddenly there's been this massive opening for those tech companies. So we see, Amazon, of course, has become a major shopping portal, but also particularly for food, having bought Whole Foods. And something like about 50% of Americans now say that they increased their online shopping of food during the pandemic, and most of that, 60%, is going to Amazon. Walmart's doing the same. They own Flipkart, and they've also massively increased that. So they're now in a position where previously a company may have a lot of information about what you're searching, they may have information about what things you're watching, they may have information about who you're talking to. But once you can begin tracking what you're buying every single day for food, and food is a very rich source of data about you, then they can begin to amass that data and use it to manipulate markets, use it to begin to target you individually, and rub it up against all kinds of other data throughout the food system. Whether that's data about how the food is grown, how it's traveled around, and so forth, or they begin to be able to reshape the food system to maximize their sales. And we can get into the sort of second half of that. One is about the data they can collect. You can collect everything from looking at what's in the sewer and your personal microbiome, the microbes on your body and in your gut, right through, of course, to your eating habits. But actually, the more worrying thing is then how you begin to manipulate that, what's called nudging, beginning to shift people's behavior, sort of one person at a time.
Can you explain that? I mean, what does nudging mean?
So nudging, the idea of nudging came out of, I think it was Cass Sunstein about 10, 15 years ago, talking about sort of little acts where you can push somebody's behavior. You can suggest things. You can suggest, maybe you want to eat this, or maybe you want to try that. And Amazon, of course, is the king of nudging. If you try and buy a book on Amazon or browse looking at something on Amazon, it will always say recommended for you, or this is what other people like who have got this. And it will be trying to encourage you to buy this or to look at this and just to change your behavior a little bit. And so nudging has now become a data science. It's become a behavioral data science. And some of the worst examples of nudging that we've seen were around Cambridge Analytica. People will be familiar about how that company used massive amounts of data about voter information from Facebook to try and target people with these micro-targeted messages to try and shift their voting behavior or to even not vote. And so that was an example of political nudging. And that sort of nudging of people's responses is also a lot of interest to companies who want to nudge our food behavior. It's called hyper nudging, this sort of data-driven shifting of how we behave. Historically, we've had nudging of whole population, or rather attempts to change whole population's views through mass media, but now we have this very narrow, targeted individual media, and the more data you have, the more you can start to move people around individually or as groups of people who appear to behave the same.
But let me pose a question here. Is this not a problem for the Western countries and people living in cities? I mean, who are ultimately a minority at the moment. I know things are changing, but Neth, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, how we wish it's like that it's just the West and the cities. But then, as I mentioned earlier, if you have governments that actually push that idea that this is the way to go, like we order food online, or we order our groceries online, we'll provide the platform, the app, etc. We are actually going to a direction. It's not just about the cities, the consumers in the cities, but those who can have access to that platform and who will be outreached by governments in terms of providing the the tools not to be able to use that, like, because like I remember from that conversation with the Minister of Agriculture, like someone actually asked, like, why are you pushing for deliveries online using this app when you don't even have a decent internet? And he said, oh, for villages you can actually go to your village office and they could have internet access there, and you can use that to order using this app. So you need this formula as well, where you have government pushing that idea as part of the new normal and providing its facilities, like in that case, for example, access to villagers in that village office to be able to order online. So it may sound ridiculous at this time, but if you have this machinery enabling everyone to make use of this platform, saying that this is the way to go, this is the new normal, then you can see that it will actually go beyond consumers in the cities. And as Jim said, like nudging could actually, in the same way, nudging could actually shape and reshape our consumer behavior, our choices. The nudging by the government and enabling the entry and also expansion of digital platform, for example, could actually make a difference. And not to mention that if you integrate this in the educational system, in media, so it actually goes into the consciousness of people. So the extent of impact of nudging then becomes far more broad, and that would have a reverberating impact on behavior, food choices, and ultimately the food system.
And Rose, I would just say
Yeah.
what's interesting in this COVID moment, looking at where the big data platforms are putting their money, like they're on an investment spree right now because they have tons of money coming in. The largest plays they're making in the last 2 months are in India. So you have Facebook is grabbing a 10% stake in one of the largest telecoms provider in India, Jio. And Amazon is also trying to get a 5% stake in Airtel, and Google's now trying to get a massive stake in Vodafone. So they're trying to grab the Indian market, which of course is a large, potentially consumer market. And those companies are also have steps into Africa. Airtel, for example, is very significant in the African continent. Ultimately, they're making long-term plays here.
Right. I mean, the reality today is that it is small farmers who are the major feeders of the world. They're the ones who produce most of the food. Now, help me understand, how does this nudging and shaping of consumer choice, as it were, of foods, how is that likely to affect the most important part of the food system, and that is small farmers?
Yes, and that's like just to put it on record that at least 70% of the world population actually depend their food from the small scale producers, including artisanal fishers, peasants, and also pastoralists. Like even FAO actually has put it higher. They said at least 80%. And you could just imagine how big that market could be. Like if you are in agribusiness, um, like how big that the potential of that market, like really looking at how you cash in on that market. And as Jim said, no, like India is a favorite target of the not just of agribusiness but also big data platform, as he mentioned. And let's take for example a particular crop, now just to make nudging more graphic. Like if you are a farmer selling or producing carrots, uh, I think carrot would be a good example. And then you are actually supplying it to the local market or even to a middleman who provides it to the big chain, and that's being sold in a digital platform, carrots, fresh carrots. And then you have nudging. Like if I type carrot, like the next thing that will pop up in my screen is a juicer. You know that I could actually, it actually conditions my mind that I more than just cooking carrots, I can actually make juice out of it. And then the next thing that will pop up in my screen is carrot juice. which is a processed product. So that does not come from farmers. Definitely the juicer and also the carrot juice is produced by somebody else, most likely big business who are doing the processing and also producing that machine. So that's the kind of like shaping. Like next time I will order, I will not bother to order carrots, but I'll probably order carrot juice produced by one of those big companies. This is just a very simplistic example on how it could actually impact on the farmer. So that means that the farmer who is actually producing the carrot and selling it, like it will that since the market will actually go towards the carrot juice, that means they will go into the processor, and then the market the carrot producer, the farmer, as as we have seen in many examples globally, would actually have to be pressed with be end up with lower price because he's not providing value to that, but that will actually be centralized and then by the middleman and then sold to the food processor. So that's just one example of how nudging could actually translate to impact to farmers. And there are actually other examples of that, but just to give you that kind of impact that it could have on that kind of big data and the data nudging that Jim was describing could have an impact on the farmer who produces the crop.
If I may say, for us, the hyper nudging that has often been called the sort of the automation of the will, if you like, at the consumer end, is just part of the package that these companies are trying to do. They're looking, actually, it's the automation throughout the whole production chain is really where the large amount of value is. So what we're seeing already is an increase in automation on the field, and an increase of trying to control farmers through requiring that they use automation and blockchains, and streamlining the delivery processes, having drone agriculture, and all the way through to sort of digital trade and so forth. All the downstream part of production is really where the money's going to be made. And one thing we're hearing in COVID, and there was a survey of CEOs, 41% of whom said they were now going to accelerate automation, including in food and agriculture. As a result of this, they're claiming that acceleration of automation is allowing for pandemic-proof food systems, contactless food systems. Having seen that the food system is actually extremely dependent on small farmers and on workers, particularly migrant workers, they're seeing this as a moment in which they can start moving workers out of the system and instead put in automation. And that works to a data-driven food system. That's actually what the likes of Amazon would like to have. Rich data coming off machines all the way through the food production chain.
Right. Well, some people would argue, well, it's very convenient that, if I order something on Amazon, I can see other things that I might be interested in. And well, what would you expect of a capitalist enterprise? I mean, they're there to make a profit. I mean, so I'd like you to elaborate on what are the threats. I mean, I think you've touched on the potential on producers, on workers in terms of employment and migrant workers. But what are the threats to citizens? What are the threats to producers that is emerging out of this, or is that still speculative?
Well, if I can start, I mean, we're seeing an acceleration to a form of agriculture and food systems which are going to be highly mechanized, which are going to increasingly move into the lands where small peasant farmers, indigenous peoples live right now. Up until now, the reason why peasants and small farmers have been able to hold their land and their spaces because, frankly, industrial agriculture cannot get there. But now with data-driven, precision, automated agriculture, they can start to take over that land. So that's immediately one threat that you have. And as you have more control of data through the food system, you can more efficiently decide what gets planted there and drive it through to a consumer who at the other end is being nudged and bamboozled to buy whatever is being grown, increasingly you're losing control over food. It's the absolute opposite of food sovereignty. Farmers at one end are going to lose control over their land and food because it's going to get taken by increasingly automated agribusiness. And at the other end, consumers may feel they still choose food, but they're going to have less control over what they choose. It's going to be decided by algorithm.
But are we not seeing also concurrently the growth of the peasant movement via Campesina? All kinds of movements are beginning to emerge, made of small farmers, the struggle for food sovereignty. That's happening concurrently, is it not? So tell me more about what impact that can have, and what should we be enabling and making happen that contests the growing hegemony of the food, the industrial food producers.
Yeah, it is true that while all this digitalization and also high-tech agriculture is expanding, that there's also an expansion of the powers of small-scale producers and peasants in many parts of the world. Like you've mentioned the example of the campesina, and also there are some movements around agricultural workers who are demanding more decent treatment for agricultural workers, and also make the contribution of agricultural workers visible. We've seen it in many parts of the world, but side by side, we're also seeing a lot of repression. Examples of repression of rights of small-scale producers to organize, like even in particular in this part of the world, like in the Philippines in particular, we've had cases, many prominent cases of suppression of rights, violation of rights of small-scale producers who are actually demanding for rights. So it's also happening at a time when you have governments, strong governments, that are out to suppress rights of people because they have to advance certain agenda. Like in the case of the Philippines, like suppression of rights of peasants also go hand in hand with expansion of agricultural plantations, particularly in this part of the Philippines in the south. We of course think that the strategic way of stopping or also challenging the powers of corporation is strengthening the power of small scale producers. But then at the same time, there's also this big movement among strong governments to suppress the rights of peasants. So it's there happening side by side.
So all this is happening in a period where neoliberal capitalism has reached a stage of crisis, all kinds of both social and political crises. And it seems to me there's a contradiction emerging here. While the food chain, the organizing of data, etc., down the entire system is now much more manipulable by the corporations. The other side is that the consumer capacity to purchase is also declining, and all the indications are that this is going to become very serious. I mean, just in the last 3 months of the COVID pandemic, we have an additional 4 million people in the United States who are unemployed. So how do you see this playing out? Is it as smooth as one might like to portray it in order to get the message across about the nature of data manipulation?
Of course, it's not smooth. I think saying this is a moment of crisis for neoliberal capitalism, yes, but it's also a moment of transformation. And in fact, it already was a moment of transformation. The World Economic Forum, which really represents the neoliberal class, was trying hard to move to what they called the fourth industrial revolution, which was about automating everything and moving everything into this data-driven model. COVID has provided the perfect bridge to that. So I think, you know, this, and under this moment, there is a chance to accelerate that. And of course, there will be an attempt to say that it was that new version of capitalism, surveillance capitalism, data-driven capitalism, that got us through this moment, that it was the Amazons and the Flipkarts and so forth. It was the fact that we were all at home watching Netflix that meant that we got through this moment. And it's simply not true. You know, what's actually getting people through this moment is small farmers, resilient food systems, migrant workers. I mean, even Amazon has had to hire 175,000 new workers. They didn't manage to hand it to the robots quite yet, but they want to, and they're doing that work. So this is a moment to say, you know, the new form of capitalism isn't quite there, and they're trying to make it there. But actually, what communities are able to do in this moment is fall back on resilience, on community mutual aid, and so forth.
So, in that context, yes, COVID has revealed for us, as for them, the very nature of this system. But COVID itself, as Sylvia Ribeiro from ETC Group talked to us a little while ago about, is itself a product of an industrial agricultural system, a deforestation system, and what came across as the link between the emergence of all these zoonotic viruses and the something that seems to have gone off the radar at the moment, and that's the global climate chaos that is emerging. How do you see that playing out in this context? Ned?
I did not get the question, Feroz. Sorry,
Well,
because my audio is breaking.
Oh, sorry. Oh, the point I'm trying to make is that COVID is itself a product of the industrial agricultural system, where there's massive deforestation, there's an industrialized agriculture, industrialized livestock production, creating all the conditions for further zoonotic viruses to emerge. And then but that's also a situation, a system that is feeding into the climate crisis that we're seeing. I mean, people are not talking about the climate at the moment because of COVID, but is there not a connection there? So it's not all smooth running for the big corporations who want to deforest and seize agricultural land.
Yeah, it's really a very complex and how do you call it, like intermarried crisis and problems. So you're right. Like barely is there any conversation about how does the climate crisis is playing out in all this? But let's like we've been discussing about the role, culpability of industrial agriculture, at least those in the progressive sector. But we are actually forgetting or not mentioning explicitly that it's industrial agriculture that is actually responsible for about 45% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the past decade. And unfortunately, they say it's agriculture, but barely is there any conversation on what type of agriculture is really the culprit behind the climate change crisis, the 45% contribution to greenhouse gas emission. What type of agriculture is responsible for the zoonotic diseases that we have seen in the past 25 years, from SARS to Asian flu to MERS to COVID-19, which has zoonosis at the core of it. And And there's been a lot of discussion on agriculture as a whole without really parsing what type of agriculture is responsible for all this. And I think it's really very important. Like as the title of this conversation is saying, it's industrial agriculture. And industrial agriculture, as we know, has been damaging to the environment. Like the all the discussions that we're having about zoonosis, environmental impact, and impact on human health are actually very graphically illustrated when you look at how poultry, commercial or industrial poultry, is living out, no, in this in the context that we have. Like here in Southeast Asia, for example, we have the world's biggest livestock or and poultry genetics producer, like CP Charwen Pokapan, and Charwen Pokapan is the world's biggest um, producer of lives of poultry genetics, and that's all very uniform poultry breeds, and this is the kind of genetic uniformity and the kind of environment that is so dependent on antibiotics and also all sorts of chemicals to be able to produce faster, bigger chicken that is behind all the problems around avian flu, for example. And there are even statistics that show how big is the contribution of poultry production itself on water pollution, even soil pollution, and even climate. So I think the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, is one very good example of um, how volatile all these combinations and all these convergences of problems that this type of industrial agriculture can bring us into, how bad it can bring us into. And I think this is a moment that we have to seize in terms of seizing the narrative, like really becoming very clear and aggressive in terms of what is wrong with industrial agriculture. Like we are slowly hearing, and I'm sure we'll hearing more and more of the leaders in the business sector, also some agriculture ministers and even UN hotshots that will tell us that the our food system is broken. You know, like it's cool to hear them say that the food system is broken, that the pandemic is an example of how broken it is. But that's not enough. We have to really identify what's the core of the problem, what makes it break. And I think we have to really point out that the culpability of industrial agriculture, because we'll be very unfair to small scale farmers, to artisanal fishers, to all these small scale producers by lumping everything in that word farmer, agriculture, without naming what the problem is and what type of agriculture has brought us into this problem.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of somebody I met who had a stamp made, which he pressed uh, things on dollar bills, saying the system ain't broken; it was made this way. And I think, you know, agriculture is industrial is made that way, and I think there are crises emerging within it. I mean, climate crisis, I think, is one of them. But what I take from what you've just said, Nat, is a really important point. In there's a growing movement against extractivism, you know, against the mining industry, um, which is characterized by theft of resources, looting, and poisoning. And but industrial agriculture has all the characteristics, does it not, of extractivism?
It is. At its core, yes. I think industrial agriculture is extractivist in every aspect of it, from the beginning to the end. And I think when they say that the food system is broken, the it's practically industrial agriculture that they're describing. As you said, it's made as such, no, as broken from the beginning. And to me, it's very important that we seize this narrative, at this point, rather than allowing those who have created a broken system to reshape the narrative by saying that they are now for regenerative agriculture. Like I just came from a webinar this afternoon where all these big names in business are actually talking about regenerative agriculture. And my God, like if we will let these people define and shape what regenerative agriculture is, like wow, that will be a big scene on our part to let them be. Because like like these people who have come out with a broken system, a very extractivist system, now seizing the moment and say that they will lead the discussion, that they will define the narrative on what regenerative agriculture is. Like, can you imagine, like big ag saying that their system is regenerative? So I think this is really the moment to pounce and really not let them steal that narrative that we have created and worked so hard for. Like the Via Campesinas of this world have actually staked their lives at the local level up to the global level to be able to create the narrative for the need for agroecology, for example. Like hearing business people talking about agroecology actually sends you the shivers that what kind of agroecology are they going to sell? Because it's not that they're creating a different system. It's the same ultra capitalist system, and then they will define what is regenerative agriculture, what is agroecology. Shall we let that happen? So I think we should really stop from with all our might from them hijacking that narrative from us.
Feroz,
Yeah.
I would just say, to complete the circle here, the big data economy is also massively extractivist. And I think that's often not clear. That not only is extractivist in the sense that in order to have, large amounts of data and this huge data infrastructure that's now being built, I mean, you need mountains of minerals and water and energy and so forth. But it's actually extractivist in that the new oil, the new mineral is data. And so companies, these large data giants are looking at whole continents. They're looking at Africa. They're looking at India, the Indian subcontinent, and they're looking how they're going to extract as much data as possible that they can then rub against each other for their new business models. So the notion of extracting massive amounts of data from us as human beings and using that to then nudge our behavior and start to rebuild the economy is a fundamentally extractivist approach. It's just not often visible.
I think that's a really important point. Really, to round up this discussion, John Berger, who worked a lot with peasants, once said that it's not that we must have hope; it is that we must shelter hope. So from what you've been talking about, yes, there are lots of serious things that we need to consider, and it's not going to be an easy thing. But where are the possibilities of sheltering hope? Jim, what's your view on
that? I mean, we've been talking about the food system, and peasant agriculture is what's feeding people. Peasant movements are organized and organizing in ever more impressive ways, especially through this pandemic, to make sure people are fed and to get through the roadblocks put in front of them. The agroecology movement is surging, and the sort of the food web of local communities being able to provide food and support each other has strengthened through this time. That's what we need to be holding up. That's the hope, and that we need to be able to say very clearly, this is what's keeping people alive. It's what's keeping our ecosystems alive. It's what's keeping our societies and cultures alive. And we don't need a transition to data-driven fourth industrial revolution where the hope is being built. It exists. It's not even hope. It's real.
Neth, your view?
For me, the place where that hope is actually sheltered is the solidarity between consumers and producers that we have seen in the time of lockdown. Like for me, that's the most inspiring and positive thing that came out in those more than 8 weeks of lockdown. Like I've seen how consumers, if given that opportunity to know where producers are and who they are, they will actually go directly and support that. Like in the area where I live here in Davao, for example, like we live around in a peri-urban area where there are actually a lot of farms, but we never knew them until lockdown came, no? When words of mouth about like this farmer is producing that, and they are arranging for delivery direct to your to consumers. Like there's really a surge of interest, no? And also this spirit of directly supporting farmers. I think this bridges between consumers and producers is key not just for survival, but key to really promoting a kind of life that we'd like to live, where you're actually relating to the producers not as a nameless entity, not as a box where you have these shelves and labels and machines, but as people who are devoting their time, sweat, generations of passion in producing food, and then linking that with those people who are consuming, and really like the awareness about healthy environment, healthy and nutritious food actually is really hinged on that relationship between consumers and producers. So I have really big hope on that, and I am confident that despite all this artificial promotion of digital technology that cannot even deliver because you don't have the infrastructure, it's far from the gut, that this bridges between consumer and producer will continue on.
If I might throw in my penny's worth of hope, and that is that the George Floyd rebellion, which is spread over 142 cities across the US and numerous other cities across the world. It is quite extraordinary. And although not directly related to food production, I think, as Leonard Cohen points out, it's one of the cracks that lets the light in. I'd like to thank you, Neth and Jim, for helping us to see the light coming through the cracks, and for a really informative session and discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ferozi. Nice to be here.
It's great, and I look forward to
Thank you.
further conversations as time goes on.
Thanks.
Thanks for being with us, and all the best, and keep up the great work. Honestly,
Keep
I
up this
think
great series.
ETC does some fabulous work. So please keep that going.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
take care. That was Jim Thomas and Nathaniel talking about the big data, big surveillance, and industrial agriculture. You should check out the ETC website. It has some most extraordinary and really, this is the leading edge research that's going on, as well as engagement in activism. So do find time to connect and have a look at the numerous reports on a wide range of topics. I'd like to say thank you for joining us today. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press, signing off from Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. Thank you for joining us.